Hello, everybody, and thanks for joining our Culture Connection series on Edgar Allan Poe. I'm Michael Beckelheimer in Washington, D.C. This program is presented by the American Center in Moscow, which is supported by the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. If you're watching on the American Center's YouTube or VK channels, please feel free to post comments anytime, questions, tell us which stories you've read of Edgar Allan Poe, tell us what you love, what you hate. We'll answer those questions as we go through our discussion today. So today we're going to explore the places Poe lived and worked during that period in American history, the early 1800s, when cities were growing, newspapers and magazines were flourishing, and Poe continued on his quest for literary fame and fortune. Our guest today is Dr. Scott Peoples, who teaches American literature, Gothic literature, and 19th century American poetry at the College of Charleston in South Carolina. He's well known for his research courses on Edgar Allan Poe. His books include The Afterlife of Edgar Allan Poe, The Man of the Crowd, Edgar Allan Poe in the City, which we'll talk about a lot today, and a forthcoming book, which has nothing to do with Edgar Allan Poe, but I know will be interesting for everyone, a new book called How Many Roads? A Life of Bob Dylan. So I suppose if you have questions about Bob Dylan, we'll take those too. He is a past president of the Poe Studies Association and the Southeastern American Studies Association. Scott, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Michael. It's good to be with you.
It's great to have you. So let's start by talking about place, the concept of place and home. And I find it such a difficult thing to figure out when we're talking about Poe because, at least for me growing up, I always thought Poe was from Baltimore. It's very closely associated with Baltimore in my mind. But it turns out, and having read your book, he's lived all over the country, at least on the Eastern Seaboard, and moved from place to place. Even when he traveled abroad, he talked about places he went that he actually never went to. He says he went to Russia, but he never went to Russia. So my first question is, where did Poe think he was from, and what was his relationship with home and the place where he was?
Well, my shtick on Poe biography is that Poe is rootless, and that even though I think it's fair to say that he had a family with Maria and Virginia Clem, that he didn't really have a place that he felt rooted in, or a place that I would think of as being a home. I mean, I'm here in Charleston, South Carolina, which happens to be where I grew up as well, and so it's easy for me to say this is my home place. But I don't think Poe really had that. I think the closest would be Richmond, Virginia, since he grew up there, and spent more time. If you count the days, he spent more time in Richmond than any other place. But even so, I mean, he wasn't born there. He was born in Boston, spent the first 3 years of his life really traveling around with his, with his family. His mother was an actress who went to different cities with acting and theater companies. And then after he left Richmond as an 18-year-old, he lived in Baltimore, back in Richmond, Philadelphia, New York. There was another brief stint in New York, and within those cities moved around frequently. So I would argue that Poe had a strong feeling of family, but didn't really have a strong feeling of home as we typically think of it, as whether it's a city or a wider location.
So yeah, rootless is a good word to describe him. He moved around a lot. Talk a little bit about how he was looking for family, or was he looking for family roots as he moved around, or was he mainly moving for work? Like, what took him from place to place?
Well, I think early in his life, maybe family roots had something to do with it. I mean, Poe grows up as a foster child with the Allen family. He's never adopted, and so his connection to the Allens is always a bit tenuous, and I think he always felt uh, I think he always felt like an orphan, or was anxious about whether or not he was going to inherit anything, whether or not he was really a member of that family. Um, so as a teenager, he, I think, begins to feel more like a Poe. And I think part of what drew him to Baltimore is that that's where he had some relatives. And it ends up that Mariah Clem, who he moves in with in Baltimore, um, his aunt also becomes his mother-in-law. And I think that his, that connection to his biological lineage led him to sort of find that family and to nurture that small family that he held together for most of his adult life.
Um, you're from the South. Poe spent a lot of time in Richmond, which at the time, of course, was about to become the capital of the Confederacy. When you teach Poe, do you encounter students who are or people who are surprised that Poe is so strongly associated with growing up in the South? And how is he perceived in terms of a Southern writer?
I, yeah, I think that depends on on who you talk to. Like you, my students tend to think of Poe as being either from Baltimore or most closely associated with Baltimore. And, especially if you're in South Carolina, nobody thinks of Baltimore as the South.
Right.
So I think for most of most students and most of the public, Poe is not generally thought of as a Southern writer, but there is a sort of a long tradition in Poe scholarship and just generally of kind of looking at that angle, since Poe did grow up in Richmond. He also spent a year near here on Sullivan's Island, when he was stationed at Fort Moultrie as an enlisted man in the Army. And there were times when Poe identified himself as a Southerner. So it's part of the mix. I don't think it's quite right to characterize him as a Southern writer myself. I mean, I think that he spent so much time in Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York. That's really where his career was. And, um, I see it as sort of these exceptional moments where he declares himself to be a Southern writer. But a lot of people have wanted to put him in that tradition. Um, for instance, to see a story like The Fall of the House of Usher, which thematically kind of jibes with 20th century Southern Gothicism, even though it's not specifically set in the South. You've got uh, you've got a kind of suspicious family lineage, a house that's about to fall down, um, these kinds of dark secrets that are never quite revealed, that seem to be somewhat Faulknerian or Tennessee Williams-ish. I mean, so I think that there's some reasons to see Poe as having some resonance with Southern literary tradition. Um, I personally tend to push back against it, though, because I think that what really, to me, what sort of defines his career is itinerancy, um, magazines, moving around in northern cities, and I think that was much more his orientation.
Yeah, yes, I would agree with that. And one of the fascinating things about Poe is there are so many different angles to who he was and what he wrote, and it's interesting to hear stories of him living in Richmond and being exposed to all of the things that were happening in Virginia before the Civil War. His family traded slaves. He would see slave auctions on the streets, and we don't really think of Poe in terms of that very specific Southern experience. Um, so it's interesting to think that, but he really considered himself more of a Northern writer. I've heard that he would he sort of blended in wherever he went. If he was in the North, he felt Northern. If he was in the South, he felt Southern. Is that part of Poe's personality to sort of be who he needs to be at that time?
Well, kind of. I mean, in a way, I think he is sort of oppositional. Like if when he's in New York, he puts on his New York Yankees cap and hates the Red Sox. I mean, uh, you know, figuratively speaking. I mean, he's very anti-Boston when he's in New York. When he was in Richmond, he was sort of anti-New York. He took on, in his book reviews, he took on the New York literary establishment. But then later he, was rubbing elbows with the New York literary establishment. So it's not always, so I guess in a way, yeah, I mean, he kind of joins the team for whatever city he's living in. I don't know that he would have defined himself as a northern writer any more than he would a southern writer. I mean, again, I think it's more, um, I think his allegiances are more temporary, and I think they're more local, really, than that.
Sure.
Um, and I think even his engagement with slavery, which, certainly in these decades aligns him with, with a Southern sensibility. Um, Even that, I mean, he's writing black characters and using sort of racist stereotypes in his fiction when he's writing in Philadelphia, as not just when he's writing in Virginia. So, I mean, I think the whole, especially through uh, cultural institutions like minstrelsy, the kind of racism that underwrote the attitudes that supported slavery, um, don't really make him uniquely Southern. I mean, he was playing that game, for most of his career in Philadelphia and New York as well.
When he was growing up, he expected to become a great poet, right? He
Hmm.
was very sure of himself. You mentioned how he was always antagonizing the other places. It seems like he had this personality and this desire to really become something and to make a real difference. Um, and yet he didn't have the money to sustain maybe the life of a poet. I think the great poets at that time had means to survive
Hmm.
and live comfortable lives. And did he expect that he would have this comfortable life and just be able to write beautiful poetry?
That's a great question. I mean, I don't know if he ever really expected it, but I know he hoped for it.
He asked for money
And
a lot.
yeah, and I think that when he was, for instance, when he kind of reconciled with his foster father, John Allen, in the around 1830, in order to get an appointment to West Point with Allen's cooperation, I think in that moment he imagined that he would be an officer. I mean, to use the kind of trite phrase, an officer and a gentleman and a poet, and that he would have money um, through Allen, and he would be able to write books of poetry. It all fell apart, finally when Allen remarried, made it clear that he wasn't going to include Poe in his will, and that's when everything changed for Poe. But I think when he was a teenager and up until he was about 20, 21 years old, he did have that dream of being a poet. He wrote 3 books of poetry that almost nobody read before he was 22 years old. Um, and yeah, and so I think that was what he was thinking. And then he realized in the early 1830s in Baltimore, that wasn't going to happen. He needed to try other ways of writing in order to make money, and he turned to fiction. And it wasn't like people were lining up to hand fiction writers cash either. But I mean, there were some opportunities writing for magazines, newspapers, especially if he focused on um, fiction that would grab people's attention, and fiction that might win prizes, a $50 or $100 prize. And that sort of became his entry into a different kind of literary marketplace that didn't require that he be a wealthy gentleman in order to do what he did.
Right. So This is when he moved to Baltimore, started writing short stories, entering contests, as you said, um, chose to, to find a way to make a living as a writer. I think, when we think about Poe and we think of all these negative, aspects of his being, alcohol, rootless, moved around a lot, caused a lot of, problems with people. But he really was a hard worker, I would say.
Oh yeah.
And so he gets to Baltimore, he writes short stories, and one of the first ones is Manuscript Found in a Bottle, for which he wins a $50 prize. And I think that sort of, as you mentioned, sent him on a trajectory in the world of short fiction, that really influenced his legacy. Um, can you tell us about this story, Manuscript Found in a Bottle? You see behind me, I have, Turbulent Seas, this
Yes.
inspired by Descent into the Maelstrom, one of
I
my
was
favorite.
going to say, I thought that was Descent into the Maelstrom, not
It
Manuscript Found
is,
in the Bottle.
it is. But the Manuscript Found in a Bottle also had some pretty
Yeah.
rough waters.
Yeah.
Um, Tell us about that story and how he came up with it, and what was the impact of winning that prize.
Well, I think probably the primary inspiration for it was the legend of the Flying Dutchman, a kind of ghost ship. What happens in the story, it's being written by someone who claims that they have been rational to a fault throughout his life, and was not given to any, kind of wild fantasies, but found himself, in a turbulent storm at sea, and is sort of thrown off of the ship that he was on, that was destined for destruction, and he ends up on another ship where, the people, gradually we kind of learned that the people on the ship are ghosts, and he also perceives that the ship is going down into a vortex, and he doesn't know, what his future brings, but it seems pretty clear to readers that he's entered into some kind of afterlife situation, and he believes himself to be alive, but he is surrounded by, essentially dead people, or ghosts. And so Poe's playing around with this line between uh, life and death, the possibility of an afterlife, the possibility of postmortem consciousness, because the guy continues to write about his experiences. And of course, as the title suggests, he stuffs his manuscript into a bottle, and we are reading this text that's been produced from the other side, from, you know a place where people aren't alive, basically, whether, whatever you want to imagine the afterlife as being. But for him, it's this mysterious huge ship.
I mean, it's a beautiful story, and it's so fascinating as you go through it. As you say, you're not quite sure what's happening. You realize the people around him are dead, and then perhaps he's dead. Um, and then it has all of the drama of this, this turbulent seafaring experience. What was his fascination with the sea? I know we're talking about cities today, but a lot of his stories, or some of his key stories, were set out in the open ocean. Um, that was a trend at the time, right? What was his inspiration?
Yeah, I mean, Poe's his personal experience with it would have been going to and from England when he was a boy. The Allens traveled and lived in England and Scotland, mostly in London, for about 4 years, when Poe was from about 6 to 11. Um, and so he knew it that way. He also, would have been on ships at various points, just moving around. But so he had some personal, he had, enough personal experience, but also just the whole idea of exploration, and particularly exploring the Arctic and the South Poles, became, in the 1820s and 30s, a kind of national fascination. And Poe was interested in it himself, but also interested in exploiting it for, for his fiction. So you've got Manuscript Found in a Bottle and Descent into the Maelstrom, which is, a little different, but the big one is the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, the novel that he wrote in the 1830s, which is really kind of tied into that idea of polar exploration and what might be what strange uh, what strange terrain and life forms might exist at the South Pole.
Yeah, and I guess now that I think about it, as you say this, a young, prodigy poet traveling across the ocean, I'm sure really sparked some ideas in his imagination and
Yeah.
served as fodder for future tales. So this short story, Manuscript Found in a Bottle, he won an award, as you mentioned. He got $50 for that award. Um, Tell us about how he changed the short story genre. Like we hear that he changed short stories, and he's famous for wanting
Mhm.
to write stories that people can sit down and read. But what really did he contribute to the short story genre or form?
Well, you know, fundamentally, I think it's a really kind of basic thing. I think Poe was among the first writers to think of what we now call the short story, which is more typically called a tale in his time. But he was one of the first writers to think of this as a genre. Um, there were short fictional narratives certainly before Poe came along, uh, but Poe, um, along with, at least in the U.S., along with Washington Irving and Nathaniel Hawthorne, um, really begins to think about this as a thing, as not just I have a story to tell and it just happens to be the length that you might be able to read in an hour or so. It's more like, okay, let's make that a rule
Mhm.
that you have to be able to read it in one sitting. And let's also make it a rule that everything in the story has to add up to something, that you don't waste words, you don't go off into tangents that aren't going to somehow thematically or in terms of plot or character development lead back to something. So um, make everything count toward a unity of effect, Poe's phrase, unity of effect, and make it a story that can be read in one sitting so that the reader really feels like they are uh, sort of under the writer's control or they're having an experience as they read it. Um, that seems so simple now, but I don't think that other writers of Poe's time were worrying about it that much. And Poe was really, in writing his what we talk about as his theory of the short story, which came in a review of a collection of stories by Nathaniel Hawthorne. He began to just sort of be self-conscious about this and to say, this is an important genre, and it may actually be a higher level genre than the novel, if you know what you're doing. So I would say that's his contribution, is just thinking of it in those terms.
Did other writers at that time, did they debate him on this? Did they realize what he was trying to do? Was it controversial at all, or were people excited by it?
No, I don't think anyone really wanted to argue with that. I mean, what would you, I'm not sure what you would say. I mean, other than, oh no, the short story will never be as important as the novel. But I mean, novels at that time still kind of had a little bit of a trashy reputation. So, um, no, I think, for one thing, I think Poe's influence was felt more after his death in terms of his development of the short story. So, um, what he said about the short story wasn't getting huge attention anyway. But later on, by the end of the 19th century, people were looking back to it and saying, "Oh yeah, he was really doing something different with the short story," and he wrote about how he was doing something different with the short story.
Good. I was going to ask if he was getting credit for the work that he did. Nowadays it seems like when you talk about short stories and the master of the short story, Chekhov comes up, or other writers. Rarely, in my experience, is it Poe. Do people appreciate Poe today for what he did for literature globally?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, as you would expect in the States, in U.S. or American literature courses, Poe gets a lot of credit. But I think also, certainly, in Spain, Latin America, um, Russia, I think Poe's legacy is really highly regarded.
Yes.
I should say France too, because I mean, it was sort of famously late 19th century Baudelaire and the symbolist poets really adopted Poe as a kind of father figure too.
Right. And also in Russia, Russian symbolists,
Yeah.
were influenced by Poe. A couple questions, three questions, one of which you've already answered, but one, it goes back to him, how he considered himself. Did he consider himself still a poet? So even at this time, he's writing short stories. He was also, of course, writing wonderful poetry, and we know a lot of his poetry that was produced throughout his lifetime. Did he consider himself a poet, or did he start to become a short story writer or a magazinist, as you have said?
Um, yeah, I'm not entirely sure how he would. I mean, he did refer to himself as a magazinist. So since you throw that word out there, I'll jump on that.
It's a fascinating
Um,
word. I've never heard of it before.
I think that he never stopped thinking of himself as a poet, but maybe he stopped thinking of himself as essentially or exclusively a poet.
Mhm.
Um, he was known uh, he was known for his criticism to a great extent.
Mhm.
Um, his short stories were widely read and highly regarded. And of course, after The Raven, there's a little bit of a gap where he didn't write quite as much poetry, but then after The Raven, that became his calling card. And so probably in his own mind as well as the public mind, he's, more a poet again. Um, so it's sort of complicated, but Poe would, poet, fiction writer, critic, theorist, all of those at once. And the word magazinist includes all of that, because what Poe wanted to do was to write for a medium that really had become kind of the predominant way of distributing literature in his time, and it accommodated his strengths, and it also allowed him to do all of these things at once. And so, like I was saying earlier, I think he kind of had this conversion in the early 1830s, um, to writing for the market. And that meant being a magazinist, that meant being versatile, and that meant specializing in shorter forms. And so, to me, that really defined Poe's career.
One of the things that's so cool about Poe is he seemed to be built for this. I don't perceive him as being this tortured writer who couldn't write what he wanted. He wrote the poetry, he wrote the short stories, the tales, he wrote the literary criticism. He wanted to actually run his own magazine. I mean, it seemed like this world that he needed to survive fit him perfectly.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and Poe, he complains, but he complains about not making enough money. He complains about other people's reputations being inflated, and his not being high enough. But he doesn't complain about not being able to write what he wants. I mean, I happen to be teaching Herman Melville in a class later today, and the story Bartleby the Scrivener, which is often read, as part of Melville's complaint about not being able to write what he wants because it won't sell. Um, Poe doesn't really ever complain about that. He's he knows what people like and he's going to deliver it. He brags about that with The Gold Bug and The Raven. He said, I know how to write a hit when I need to. And so I think that's really more the kind of writer he was.
Right. And you mentioned a minute ago that, after The Raven, he was so well known for The Raven. Before that, his most popular story was The Gold Bug, right?
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
one of our viewers has said that the bolt, has given a shout out for The Gold Bug. I mean, we all love that story. Let's talk briefly about the Gold Bug, because he wrote that basically in Charleston on Sullivan's Island, where you are. What was it about that story that was so interesting to American audiences?
Well, just for the record, he didn't write it here, but he did.
Right.
He said it on Sullivan's
Center
Island.
on Sullivan's Island.
Um, and he published it years later in Philadelphia, wrote and published it. Not really that, just a couple of years before The Raven. But I think that part of the popularity, I think, was the setting, because especially for readers who were not from the Sea Islands or the Low Country, that was kind of, even though Poe may not have gotten all of the details right, but I think it's kind of an exotic setting, a place where a pirate might bury treasure, and you've got this eccentric guy, Legrand, who has this ingenuity about solving cryptograms and knowing how to find that treasure. So, I mean, I think that's just a cool plot. And it also, along with some other things that Poe was writing around that time, including the detective stories, it's the kind of thing that made people associate him with this ability to solve intricate puzzles. So it serves him well, because I think the natural tendency, if you read a story like The Gold Bug, is to think that it would take somebody who is himself a genius to write a story in which someone ingeniously unfolds a plot, or finds a buried treasure using a map that's written in invisible ink, and you have to decipher it and all of that stuff. So I think, it had those kinds of things going for it, to make it really popular.
And
Um,
this came before Murders in the Rue Morgue, right? Was
um, yeah, you're testing
I'm
uh,
sorry.
my
I'm
chronology
not
here.
trying to give you a gotcha
Okay,
question. I'm just thinking the Gold Bug had some of those
they're
early tendencies for detective fiction.
yeah, they're almost at the same time. They're both like 42, 43, and I'm gonna guess that Murders in the Rue Morgue might have been just a little bit before the Gold Bug, but they're pretty close, in terms of the timeline.
So he was
But
moving into his detective fiction phase.
yeah, yeah, and Poe had, around the same time, he was also in his sort of editorial writing, his magazine writing. Um, he started this challenge, asking, sort of inviting readers to send coded messages for him to decode. Um, so he positioned himself as someone who was really good at solving cryptograms and had that kind of analytical skill. So at the same time, he's writing these stories like the Murders in the Rue Morgue, and the Gold Bug, that hinge on having that kind of combination of ingenious intuition and mathematical prowess, um, to solve things that would, the solutions to which would amaze other people.
And let's talk about Philadelphia. We're here to talk about Poe and the City. And I'll plug your book, Man of the Crowd. We're going to talk about that
Thanks.
story. It's a great book. Um, Philadelphia, my impression is that was sort of the biggest city that he really, well, I know he was in New York for a while, but Philadelphia seems to be the place where so much happened, and where the stories that really incorporated those themes that were emerging because of the growth of the city. The Man of the
Mhm.
Crowd, um, Murders in the Rue Morgue in Paris. Can you talk to us about the American city at that time, the growth, the changing economics, the opportunities for Poe, and how that impacted what he wrote?
Yeah, I mean, this period, even though the United States before the Civil War would seem, you know, very rural to anyone living today, at the time, urbanization was taking place on an unprecedented scale. Um, cities like Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York were their populations were practically doubling by the decade. And so that kind of change and this fascination that people had with the way that cities were developing, and what they meant for for American society. I mean, that was a real source of, constant interest. And Poe, he needs to live in these places in order to ply his trade and to sell his work, right? And so he's also kind of reflecting that same kind of interest. So, uh, yeah, I mean, the detective stories have to take place in cities. He might translate them to Paris, um, to make them a little bit more exotic, or to choose a city that's even bigger than, the one he was living in at the time. But the detective stories are very much urban tales, and Murders in the Rue Morgue is a perfect example of that. The In the story, one of the key clues for Dupin is that the testimony that he reads about from all of the neighbors who overheard, what led up to the murder, they all claim that the voice they heard was speaking a language, um, that they were unfamiliar with, and they all guessed at what the language was. Um, and that's only plausible if you're living in a place where there are so many immigrants, and so many people from other, there so many people sort of on the move, that that could actually happen. I mean, it's still a little bit far-fetched in the way it's presented in the Murders in the Rue Morgue, but it's clearly this phenomenon of you know, people not necessarily knowing who their neighbors are, and people sort of being used to hearing a foreign language spoken nearby and only knowing that it's not the language that they speak. So just little things like that. I mean, and then there's the story, The Man of the Crowd, which preceded the Dupin stories, in which, the narrator follows, another man through the streets of London, all night, and he's fascinated by the fact that the man seems to need to find a crowd. Um, he becomes at least he believes the man becomes apprehensive whenever he's alone. That might be because somebody's following him, but at any rate, he kind of theorizes that this is sort of a new kind of person, a person who lives in a city, and the city is the water he swims in, so he has to constantly find a crowd. Um, and even though that's set in London and Poe was writing it, from Philadelphia, it seemed to be what was happening to a lot of people. It seemed to be what was happening in American cities like Philadelphia and New York, at the time.
Why is it that Poe set his stories in places where he wasn't? Like I know he lived in London, but he was in Philadelphia. It was bustling for that time. Did he choose London because he needed more people on the streets? The same with Paris. He was never in Paris, was he?
No.
But he set his mysteries in Paris. Um, uh, is it important to know why he chose the places he chose and why they all seem sort of either vague or not really related to where he is at the moment?
Um, I wish I knew. I mean, really, I wonder why Poe didn't set more of his fiction in the places where he was living at the time. He did set, I mean, he did set a number of stories in American locales. So it's not as if he never did it. I mean, in fact, after about 1843, he starts to do that a lot more. Um, but it does happen to be the case that the stories he's best known for today mostly, Gothic stories like The Fall of the House of Usher or The Black Cat or The Telltale Heart, he doesn't specify a city. He doesn't name a city. So
He doesn't even name a country.
doesn't even name a
It
country.
could be
Absolutely
anywhere.
right. So why he doesn't say, that The Telltale Heart takes place in Hoboken, I don't know, but it's interesting. And as for London and The Man of the Crowd, I do think that, your guess that he just wanted the most infamously crowded city that people would recognize, whether they recognize as such, whether they've been there or not. I think that's probably the most logical answer. Paris might have just been because he thought it was cool, and he thought that he thought that readers would respond to that. They would think, "Oh, Paris." I don't know. He did write about the cities he lived in, but also had that tendency that you talk about to set stories in places that he was not currently living or maybe not even familiar with from experience.
Right. And probably we shouldn't overthink it. I mean, it's not, why he chose to set a story in the place he chose may or may not give us a huge insight into his thinking. But one person did just ask, do you think that using a different location shows a disdain for where he's living? And this goes back to your early point of his rootlessness. Is
Yeah.
there something about Poe where he's never happy where he is and he's always on the move? And he even writes about different places for that reason.
That's a good question, and I wish I could give a good answer to it because I mean it's not as if Poe uh, is writing letters to friends saying, "Oh God, I hate New York," and I mean, so he's not really expressing that kind of thing personally. But I think that that could be the case because um, he didn't I think it's safe to say that he didn't really like living in crowded uh, urban environments. And so it might not have been so much disdain for this particular city that he was living in, but disdain for uh, densely populated urban life or a discomfort with it, if not disdain. Because one of the interesting things about Poe's biography is that when he could, he lived on the outskirts of a big city, um, not in the thick of it. I mean, he would live in the thick of it when he had to, but given the opportunity, he would try to move within striking distance of editorial offices and the publishing center, but not right there. Maybe a 30-minute walk away, where it was where the air was a little bit cleaner, and maybe there was uh, less excrement in the streets or whatever.
Right. Well, like in New York, he lived for one point out in the Bronx, which at that time was a quiet, peaceful area of New
Right.
York. Was it?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and I think I mean, despite the fact that Poe's wife Virginia died while they were living in the Bronx in Fordham, um, he liked it there. And that was a place where he did tell people what he thought about his living conditions and his environment, and they were really positive. It was almost perfect for Poe. It was on the Harlem Railroad line, so he could get in and out of Manhattan and Lower Manhattan, which was really where the action was for him. But it was really, it was pretty rural. His rent was cheap. Um, like $100 a year, which even then was pretty good. So that the cottage in the Bronx might have been the best living arrangement he ever had. I mean, the house that's in Philadelphia that's now the National Historic Site was also really pretty good. I mean, he was getting a good deal there as well, and had more space, and it wasn't in a crowded part of the city either at the time. But that was what Poe preferred. I think almost certainly.
There's another, so speaking of cities and whether or not he had disdain for the cities or felt comfortable in them, there's another story, Peter Pendulum, the businessman, which is hilarious. It's a funny story, and
Yeah.
people should know that Poe is funny. Um, can you tell us about that story, and what does that say about American capitalism and the growth of the cities and the sort of the typical American idea of making money and um, ripping people off, basically? What tell us about that story?
Well, I mean, I think what it comes down to is that the narrator, who proclaims himself to be basically a businessman with a method, a self-made man, and thinks of himself as being legitimate, is actually basically a petty con man, and he comes up with schemes to make money by essentially creating problems and then getting people to pay him to remove them or to stop doing whatever he was doing. Like um, one of his lines of work is to splatter mud on people as they walk by on a certain street corner, and when people see that he's going to do that, they'll pay him not to. Um, but what makes the story funny is that he discusses this in terms that, I mean, he regards this as a kind of respectable trade. Um, and so he's either fooling himself or he's, kind of winking at us the whole time, because he's, again, it's like in the long tradition of American con man, con man literature, this is, kind of a key text, I think.
I was going to ask. There is a tradition of this con man in literature, and
Yeah.
this seems to this does play a role in that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, maybe I'm a terrible person, but I think it's hilarious. The horrible things that he does just so he can make money. Nobody gets hurt, but
Right,
he's an
right.
awful person.
He builds he erects a crappy looking hovel next to a mansion
Mhm.
so that he can get the person who owns the mansion to pay him to tear it down.
Right.
Um, so
That's
yeah, I
real.
think it's funny too. But a lot of the humor is really in the way he delivers it. That sort of self-seriousness and pride that he takes in his work.
What do your students find most enjoyable about Poe? Do they gravitate more towards the tales of terror, or do they actually dive into, or do you make them dive into those lesser known stories that um, they might not know about?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the class. I mean, last semester in the fall, I was fortunate enough um, to teach a course on Poe and Hawthorne. So they did do more of a deep dive, um, and read some of the satires, and read some of the less well-known stories. Um, but typically, within the framework of whatever course I'm teaching, we're going to stick to the greatest hits. And so that's going to mean Usher, uh, The Telltale Heart, The Black Cat, The Raven. Um, and I never get tired of teaching those, so that's great. But I think students mostly that's what they read, and so that's what they get into. And I think also with Poe's image in popular culture, um, that is that's what they really kind of want to 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 talk about. I mean, the Poe of works like The Raven and The Telltale Heart.
What is your summary of Poe as a writer, and what do you try to get across to your students? Like, what are some of the key messages that you want them to know or leave your class with that perhaps they don't know?
Well, a lot of what we've been talking about today, I mean, is what I would like them to know, that Poe wasn't a, that he wasn't a crazy isolated figure, who dropped his manuscripts out of a tower, and people kind of picked them up and worshiped them. that he was a hardworking editor, critic, magazinist, and that that his career tells a pretty interesting story about that moment in American literary history. So that's one thing. I want them to know that Poe was versatile. So even if we don't read something like The Businessman, or The Man That Was Used Up, I want them to know that he did that too, that he didn't just write The Raven and The Fall of the House of Usher. But I also, and then I also want them to know something else that we talked about at the beginning, which was the contribution that Poe made to the development of the short story, and that he had he kind of had a mission to make this genre a prestige genre, and the kind of genre that serious writers would want to work in.
What are your students writing about when they take your courses and they're analyzing Poe and they're writing papers? What are some of the themes that they find interesting to explore? Like, what does Poe mean to young college students in 2026?
Well, I think they're definitely interested in the psychology at work in some of his stories. Um, things that you would expect and that I think readers have always kind of gravitated towards still mean a lot to students today. Like The Raven, I mean, and uh, the way that it expresses a grief that you need to get beyond, but that you just can't. Um, I mean, honestly, a lot of my students find that poem not just a kind of cool technical achievement, but they find it really moving
Mhm.
in the way that it develops that self-torture that you just can't move yourself out of when you're grieving. Um, I think they're also really interested in gender and in the way that women are represented in Poe's stories. Um, and yeah, whether it's Madeline Usher being entombed, or the wife in the black cat being murdered, or on the other hand, women being sort of worshipped in the poetry, especially like To Helen or Annabel Lee. Poe saying that the death of a beautiful woman is unquestionably the most poetic topic in the world. I mean, it's safe to say that my students want to interrogate that idea, and they want to talk about that.
Last
So
week we got Amy Armienta's opinion on that quote.
yeah, right. So yeah, those are a couple of things that students still really gravitate toward.
Do you think there's one American city that can really lay claim to Poe?
Um, I'm going to say no, because if the thesis, if my book, The Man of the Crowd, has a thesis, it's that Poe was essentially rootless and, in a sense, very modern in the sense that he was a man who spent most of his life in cities, moved on average almost once a year throughout his adult life, and was not really rooted in any place. So I want to stick to that. But I will say that Richmond probably is the city where he spent the most time. And if he was ever going to call a place home, that probably would be it, since he grew up there. And just before his death, he spent several weeks back in Richmond, may have been contemplating a move back there. So if you pressed me and I had to pick one, I would probably go with Richmond. But again, I feel like what really defines Poe's career is his itinerancy and his rootlessness.
Got it. All right. Well, I won't press you any further.
I'm
Um,
sorry. I'm sorry about the long-winded answer, but that's
no,
something I have thought about a lot and talked to people about a lot, honestly.
Yeah. Is that a common question people have?
Yeah, it is. And also, I mean, full disclosure, I've been on the board of the Richmond Poe Museum for the last about decade. And I love the work that they're doing at the Richmond Poe Museum. It's so I've become somewhat caught up in questions of uh, where Poe belongs in terms of civic pride. I mean, also Baltimore. I know you're gonna be talking with Enrica Zhang soon, and she's done tremendous work with Poe Baltimore. Baltimore has a really strong claim to Poe as well. But I mean, I think that this sort of tussle between cities with Poe connections is good for everybody as long as people don't take it too seriously. I think there's enough Poe to go around, but I think because um, you know I know these people and I love these sites, the Poe House in Baltimore, the Poe Museum in Richmond, the Philadelphia House, the Bronx Cottage. Um, it's something that I end up talking about a lot with folks at those places.
Well, and the path you took to write your book, The Man of the Crowd, going to these different places
Yeah.
with a photographer. I mean, I can certainly relate to that. That the sort of going to all the places where the writer was, and sort of trying to get a sense of what was happening at that time and feeling the presence. I mean, that in itself is such an important exercise to really get to know a writer, I think. And what you did with that book is so fascinating.
Thanks.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for joining us. It's a wonderful conversation. I learned a lot more about Poe. I think you're right. There's enough Poe to go around. So, thanks, Scott. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Michael. I really enjoyed it.
Great. And for the rest of you, we'll be back again with a couple more sessions about Poe in American history, American literature, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.